The prenuptial agreement was 11 pages long and Preston slid it across the kitchen island on a Tuesday evening like it was a dinner menu. He said his family's attorney had drawn it up, that it was standard, and that his mother thought it was the responsible thing to do given the Calloway family trust. He said it with the tone of a man who had rehearsed the sentence and was relieved to finally deliver it. I picked it up. I read every page carefully and without rushing. I asked 2 questions: whether the intellectual property clause covered professional methodologies developed before the marriage, and whether the separate property definition extended to business entities already incorporated and operating before the wedding date. His attorney confirmed by email the following morning that yes, both were covered under the existing language. Then I signed it. Preston was visibly surprised. I could see it in the way his shoulders released when I handed it back. He had been braced for negotiation or upset, or at minimum the long silence of a woman calculating what she was giving up. What he received instead was a woman who had already done her calculating months before that Tuesday, and who understood with complete clarity that the document he was asking her to sign said nothing, not one clause, not one sentence, about the company she had already built and was actively operating 2 miles from where they were standing. That oversight would cost his family years of legal fees and the systematic collapse of every argument their attorney eventually filed. But on that Tuesday evening in that kitchen in Buckhead, nobody in the room knew that except me. My name is Simone Ackafer. I am 41 years old and I have spent my entire adult life learning to see what other people overlook. I grew up in Decatur, Georgia, the oldest of 3 daughters. My father repaired commercial HVAC systems across the Atlanta metro area. My mother taught 3rd grade at the same elementary school for 26 years and managed our household finances with the kind of daily precision that I can only describe as devotional. She had a Spiral Mead 5-star notebook, college-ruled navy cover, that she kept in the kitchen drawer. And every Sunday evening she sat at that table and updated it. Every dollar that came in, every dollar that went out, every figure that needed watching. She never made it dramatic, she made it ordinary, the way brushing your teeth before bed is ordinary. She said, "Simone, the only thing between a plan and a wish is a number. Write the number down." I have written every number down since I was 11 years old at that table. That habit, ordinary, weekly, unremarkable, is the reason I still have everything. I graduated from Emory University with a master's degree in financial risk management in 2004. It was not a glamorous field to enter at 23, but it was exactly the field I wanted. Risk is not about predicting disaster. It is about understanding exposure, what you have, what threatens it, and what structures you have built to protect it before anything goes wrong. I spent 7 years at a regional bank in Atlanta working in their enterprise risk division, was promoted 3 times and left in 2011 for a senior advisory role at a financial consulting firm. I spent 4 years there learning from the inside how a well-run practice is actually organized. Its cost structure, its margins, its client relationship management, and crucially its documentation standards. A financial consulting firm that cannot document its own operations cleanly has no business managing anyone else's risk. By 2015 I understood the consulting business well enough to build it myself. I had the relationships, I had the methodology, I had 11 years of professional reputation assembled by doing work that was more thorough than clients expected and more accurate than the engagement letter required. I incorporated Ackafer Strategic Risk Advisors in the state of Georgia in the spring of 2015. I opened a dedicated Wells Fargo business checking account in the company's name, requiring my signature alone for any transaction. I signed an office lease at a shared professional workspace near Ponce City Market in Atlanta. I secured my first 2 client engagement letters from regional financial services organizations I had been cultivating for nearly 2 years. I obtained my certification from the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, which formally authorized the practice to offer advisory services in its licensed categories, and I built a 5-year financial projection model in Microsoft Excel, 3 scenarios, conservative, moderate, and optimistic, showing the company reaching 7-figure annual revenue within 3 years under the conservative assumptions. 3 weeks before my wedding to Preston Calloway, I sat at my desk in that office near Ponce City Market and looked at the articles of incorporation, the Wells Fargo account statements, the signed engagement letters, and the FINRA certification in the file folder on my desk. The prenuptial agreement was in the kitchen of the Calloway estate. It said nothing about any of this. I drove to Buckhead and I signed it. They called it my little firm. That was Dorothea's phrase, Preston's mother, and she used it consistently across the 5 years of our marriage with the particular warmth of someone who is being polite about something they have already fully dismissed. Your little firm. She said it at dinner parties when someone asked what I did, offering the phrase before I could answer as if she were providing helpful context about a hobby. She said it to her friends over the phone. She said it to Garrett, Preston's younger brother, who repeated it back to me once without understanding I was within earshot. Your little firm. 3 words that contained a complete and unwavering theory of what I was, what I had built, and what it was worth. I filed it. Every time she said it, I noted it and filed it. I did not argue with her, did not correct her in company, did not make a scene at a family dinner. I went home after those evenings and I opened my Excel projections and updated the figures and watched the numbers grow, quarter by quarter, into something that could not be contained by that phrase no matter how many times she said it. Preston Calloway was 34 years old when I met him at an industry networking event in Atlanta in the fall of 2015. He worked in commercial real estate development for a regional firm with a solid footprint across Georgia, and carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who had grown up with resources and understood their language without having had to consciously study it. He was charming in a way that felt unconstructed. He listened when you talked, not waiting for his turn, but actually listening so that he remembered specific things you had said weeks later without apparent effort. He called when he said he would call. He showed up to things he had agreed to show up to. I do not want to overstate his virtues because this is not a story about his virtues, but I will not understate them either because I did not marry a man I had not examined carefully, and I married him for reasons that were real at the time. We dated for 7 months before he introduced me to his family. The evening at the Calloway estate in Buckhead was the first time I met Dorothea, and within the first 90 minutes I understood clearly who she was in that family's structure and what role she played in the decisions that mattered. She was the managing intelligence, the person who knew the trust documents, the account structures, the name of every attorney and accountant on retainer, and the purpose of every financial instrument the family held. She had accumulated this authority incrementally over the decades since Preston's father had died of a cardiac event at 53, and it had solidified into something that no longer needed to announce itself. She was not unkind to me that evening. She was precisely as warm as she intended to be, which is a different thing entirely from warmth freely given. Preston proposed in the spring of 2016 at a restaurant in Virginia Highland without theater or audience, which I appreciated more than I told him. We married that September at a venue in Ansley Park. 160 guests, a string quartet during the ceremony, a reception that ran until 11. My mother sat in the front row in a wine-colored dress she had purchased at Macy's and altered herself at the waist, and her expression when I walked down the aisle was the expression she has always had when she is watching me move through something consequential. Not worried, not sentimental. Watchful, the expression of a woman who knows the full scope of what her daughter is carrying and is watching to see how she carries it. The first year and a half of the marriage was, in the ways that genuinely matter, good. I want to say this clearly because the story that follows should not be read as the story of a marriage that was always a mistake. It was not. Preston and I had real compatibility in the rhythms of daily life. We had Sunday mornings that were genuinely unhurried coffee, the New York Times, the comfortable quiet of two people who do not need to fill every silence. We had things we laughed about together that no one else would have found funny. There was something real there. What happened to it was not a single failure or a single moment. It was the slower friction of two people whose trajectories, over time, moved in directions the original arrangement could not sustain. ACA for Strategic Risk Advisors closed its first full operating year in 2017 with 6 active client relationships and $340,000 in annual revenue. I had hired my first full-time employee, a junior analyst named Marcus who had just finished his master's at Georgia State and who had a facility for quantitative risk modeling I recognized in the first 2 months as genuinely exceptional. I was traveling 4 to 6 days a month for client engagements, mostly Delta flights out of Hartsfield-Jackson, almost always direct, managing every business expense through an American Express corporate card tied to the company's accounts, reconciled weekly through QuickBooks, every receipt photographed with the Expensify app before I boarded the return flight. I was running our Salesforce account myself, updating every relationship stage and every follow-up date. And when I was home, I was being the partner I had agreed to be, present, engaged, managing my share of the household without complaint. I tracked household expenses in a Google Sheets file I maintained every Sunday evening: income, mortgage payment, utilities, groceries, every category that touched the shared budget. I did this because it was how I operated, not because I was preparing anything. The file was simply accurate. I kept it the way my mother kept her Mead notebook, because accurate records of what is yours are not a defensive posture. They are just honesty applied to numbers. By the end of 2018 we had 14 active clients, 3 full-time employees, 2 contractors, and $890,000 in annual revenue. 90 days from the 7-figure threshold I had modeled in my conservative scenario. Preston had a professionally difficult year that year. A promotion he had been tracking for 2 years went to a colleague with greater seniority, and his firm went through a structural reorganization that disrupted his client relationships and reduced his income in ways that were both real and visible. I watched him absorb this with the kind of pride management that makes difficulty harder rather than easier. He redirected rather than processed, and some of that redirection expressed itself as a subtle ongoing friction in the texture of our marriage that I noticed and did not yet have clean language for. In the first quarter of 2019, I brought on Ketchera Asant as our first director-level hire. Ketchera had spent 12 years at one of Atlanta's major banks, most recently as a senior director in their commercial risk division, and she brought a network, a methodology, and an operational discipline that fundamentally changed what the company could do. We expanded the Peachtree Street office into a full floor with 4 private offices, a proper conference room, and a reception area that communicated immediately and without announcement that this was a serious organization. I hired Priscilla, our Director of Client Strategy, in the third quarter of 2019. We moved to App for payroll, added a Silicon Valley Bank small business reserve account alongside the Wells Fargo operating account, and ran every expense through Expensify and QuickBooks with a monthly close that never slipped. I want to describe what a typical week looked like in 2019 and 2020, because the texture of it matters to understanding what I was managing simultaneously and what the company's documentation actually captured. I kept two distinct types of records during those years, and the distinction matters. The first type was company records, the Salesforce contact database, the QuickBooks monthly closes, the ad payroll runs, the Expensify receipt archive, the Wells Fargo and Silicon Valley bank statements, the client engagement files with every signed letter and every renewal. All of it lived in the company's systems, in the company's name, accessible only through company credentials. The second type was personal records, the Google Sheets household budget, my personal Chase checking account statements, my personal tax returns filed separately from the company's corporate returns each year. These two categories of documentation had at no point in the company's history touched each other, not one transaction, not one shared account, not one transfer. They were separate because that is correct practice for an LLC, and because I had been trained since childhood to know the difference between what is mine, what is ours, and what belongs to the organization I have built. That distinction, maintained daily without drama as a simple matter of operational hygiene, became, in the context of a divorce proceeding, the cleanest possible rebuttal to a legal theory that required exactly the opposite to be true. There was a version of Tuesday evenings in the Peachtree Street office in 2019 that I want you to be able to see, because it captures something the legal documents cannot. After the staff meeting, after the client calls, after the Salesforce updates and the expense reconciliation and the QuickBooks entries, I would sometimes sit at my desk for 10 or 15 minutes before leaving for the night. The office was quiet. The city outside was doing what Atlanta does at 7 in the evening in summer, which is settle into a warmth that does not feel oppressive once the direct sun has dropped, and I would look at the projection model on my screen, not to update it, just to look at it, and I would think about the 11-year-old at a kitchen table indicator who had learned that the only thing between a plan and a wish is a number. I was living inside a plan that was working exactly the way I had built it to work. That was not luck, it was the accumulated weight of 11 years of professional discipline, of documentation habits, of projections built conservatively and executed patiently. Nobody in the Calloway family knew that version of Tuesday evenings. They knew the version I brought to their dinner table on Saturdays, which was different but not dishonest. It was simply not the whole picture. Nobody had asked for the whole picture. And I had learned long before I met any of them that you do not offer the whole picture to people who have already decided what they see. Monday through Wednesday I was usually at the Peachtree Street office. Tuesday mornings were staff meetings, 25 minutes standing, no laptops, because I wanted people talking to each other rather than at screens, and the habit had become part of the company's operating culture in a way I was quietly proud of. Wednesday afternoons I blocked for new business conversations. Some were relationship maintenance calls with existing clients, some were first or second conversations with prospective ones. I tracked every contact, every stage, every follow-up date in Salesforce. Thursday and Friday were often travel days. I flew Delta out of Hartsfield-Jackson, almost always on the early morning departure, and I was back by Sunday afternoon at the latest. Every business expense from every trip, every receipt from every airport, every hotel invoice, every client dinner was photographed in Expensify and categorized before I boarded the return flight. Not because I was anticipating a legal proceeding that was still 3 years away. Because that is how you close a month cleanly, and a month that closes cleanly builds a year that closes cleanly, and a year that closes cleanly builds a company whose records can withstand any scrutiny. At home, Preston and I had a rhythm that functioned for most of 2019. He cooked on the nights I traveled and I cooked on the nights I was home. We had Sunday mornings that were still recognizably ours, coffee, unhurried, the kind of quiet that requires two people who trust each other enough not to fill it. I want you to know those Sunday mornings were real. The marriage had real things in it. I am not telling you a story about a woman who was always in danger and always knew it. I am telling you a story about a woman who built something correctly and protected it correctly, and who then discovered that the correct building and the correct protection were what she had needed all along, for reasons she had not yet had to name. By the close of 2020, Aca Strategic had 21 active client relationships, 7 full-time employees, 4 contractors, and annual revenue that had passed $2 million. We had signed the largest single engagement in the company's history, a regional insurance conglomerate based in Atlanta, a 6-figure annual retainer. I had also spent the latter part of that year developing our Charlotte, North Carolina pipeline, visiting prospective clients in the Carolinas twice and building relationships that would eventually support a second office. In October of 2020, on Francis Osei Bonsu's recommendation, I commissioned a formal business valuation. Francis had been my personal attorney since 2013, retained originally when I incorporated my first consulting partnership, and she had the quality of counsel that makes potential adversaries feel structurally underprepared simply by knowing you have retained her. She had been watching the dynamic in my marriage shift across the preceding year and said to me in September, "Simone, before this develops further, I need you to have a formal dated assessment of the enterprise on file in my possession before anyone on the other side requests one." I engaged Hartwell Partners, a mid-market valuation firm in Atlanta specializing in financial services companies. The process took 6 weeks. The resulting report was 43 pages. The enterprise valuation of Aca Strategic Risk Advisors as of the assessment date was $4,200,000. I sat in Frances's conference room when she handed me the summary page. I read through the comparable transactions section, the revenue multiple analysis, the risk-adjusted forward projections. Then I set the report on the table and sat with that number for a moment in the specific way you sit with something that has been true for a long time and is now official. I said, "File it, nobody outside this room sees this number yet," she said. "Understood." The marriage had been ending in the quiet, factual way that marriages end before either person says so, for longer than I had been willing to name. By early 2021, Preston and I were living in the same house with a quality of distance between us that was no longer ambiguous or deniable. He had begun over the preceding year a pattern I recognized from organizational dynamics, the incremental construction of a contribution narrative around an outcome you had no substantive role in producing. He had introduced himself as co-founder of my company at a Buckhead event, a title he had never held at any point in the company's history. He had suggested on more than one occasion that a company on our trajectory might benefit from a formalized co-leadership structure. He had mentioned across several different conversations that the household stability he had provided during the company's early years represented a contribution that deserved formal acknowledgement. I noted each instance without reacting. After the fourth, I called Frances and described what I was observing. She asked her standard questions. Is he on any company documentation? No. Any business accounts? No. Has any company revenue ever touched a joint account or any account in his name? Never, not once in any direction for any purpose. She said, "Keep it exactly that way." Then she said the thing I have returned to many times since: people do not move to claim something until they understand what the thing is worth. The fact that he is beginning to position himself tells me he is beginning to understand. Make sure we are fully prepared before anyone files anything. I also called my sister Adana, who teaches sociology at Spelman College and who has the specific quality of insight that people who study social systems and are also your family tend to have. She sees the structural dynamics of what you are experiencing before you have finished describing them. I told her what I was watching unfold. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You know what this is?" I said, "I know what it looks like." She said, "It looks exactly like what it is. A man who watched you build something he never took seriously, who now that it cannot be ignored is trying to attach himself to it retroactively." She was not telling me anything I had not already understood. What she was doing was naming it clearly enough that I could stop examining it from every angle and redirect the energy I had been spending on uncertainty toward what actually needed to be done. In March of 2021, I told Preston I wanted to separate. We were in the kitchen after dinner. It was early spring in Atlanta, the particular low gold light of late March evenings, and I said it plainly. I believed we had become people who were no longer building toward the same thing, and I did not believe that continuing to share the same house would change that. He was quiet for a long time, then he said, without any preliminary, without grief or reconsideration or the honest question of what happened to us, the company, 2 words. In those 2 words was the entire architecture of what the preceding 18 months had actually been. Not a husband experiencing the dissolution of a marriage, a person assessing a position. I said, "I would like you to move out this week if that is possible." He left that night and went to his mother's house in Buckhead, which is where I had expected him to go, and the legal position that arrived through his attorney 3 weeks later was structured with the specificity of something assembled with professional guidance applied quickly. His attorney raised the marital contribution theory, sometimes called transmutation, which is the legal mechanism by which a spouse argues that a business developed during a marriage was materially enabled by their domestic and financial contributions, and therefore contains a marital component subject to equitable distribution. It is not a frivolous argument. Properly constructed with the right factual foundation, it can succeed. What it requires is either documented financial intermingling between the household and the business, evidence of operational involvement from the claiming spouse, or at minimum a fact pattern in which clean and continuous separation between the business and the marital household cannot be demonstrated with clarity. ACA for Strategic Risk Advisors had no surface area for this argument, not 1 square inch. Francis presented the documentation at the first settlement conference. The Wells Fargo and Silicon Valley Bank business accounts, never connected to any account in Preston's name at any point in the company's history. The corporate tax filings as a fully independent entity for every operating year from 2015 forward. Payroll records for all employees including myself, structured entirely through the company with no connection to household finances at any point. Client engagement letters dated 14 months before the wedding. The FINRA certification dated 3 weeks before the wedding. The Peachtree Street office lease in the company name, the traveler's professional liability policy in the company name, the articles of incorporation dated spring 2015. And then, because I had maintained it as a personal practice since my mother first handed me a felt tip pen and a navy notebook at age 11, 2 years of annotated household budgeting spreadsheets from Google Sheets showing that my personal income had covered 61% of our shared household expenses during 2016 and 2017, the 2 years Preston's argument most depended on, timestamped, categorized, unambiguous. Preston's attorney asked for a recess after Francis finished presenting the 3rd category of documentation. The transmutation argument was never formally filed. It was assessed against the available evidence found to have no viable surface area and quietly abandoned before it reached paper. The settlement negotiation that followed across the next 4 months addressed the actual marital assets. The Buckhead house equity divided equitably on the basis of documented contributions from both parties, and the joint Vanguard investment account divided equally. Both outcomes were fair. The company was not part of either outcome because the company was never a marital asset. It had been treated as inconsequential for so long that by the time someone moved to claim it, it was too large, too cleanly documented, and too structurally separate for any claim to find a surface to grip. The settlement was signed in April of 2022. By that date, Acafa Strategic had 17 active clients, had just closed its largest single engagement in company history, and was operated by a staff of 22 professionals who had no idea the company was simultaneously named in a divorce proceeding, because I had been deliberate about ensuring the legal process never touched the operational one. Frances set her pen down after the final signature and said, "I have handled a great many settlement proceedings. I have never seen documentation this complete and this clean." I said, "My mother kept a budget." Frances said, "I know you've mentioned that." She laughed. I laughed. It was the first time either of us had done so in several months. The weeks after the settlement were not what people imagine when they picture the successful end of a legal proceeding. There was no triumph. There was the cessation of a specific kind of sustained pressure, the way your body notices for the first time that it has been braced for 14 months. I drove home from Frances's office through ordinary Atlanta traffic on an ordinary April afternoon and sat in my parking garage for a few minutes before going upstairs. I let myself feel the full weight of what the preceding year had required, running the company without letting the legal proceedings touch a single client deliverable or a single member of my team, handling the logistics of dissolving a shared household, coordinating the listing and sale of the Buckhead house, finding and purchasing the Morningside house in my name alone, completing the mortgage refinancing with a lender who had no idea they were issuing a loan to someone in the middle of a divorce, because there was no reason for them to know, because my personal financial documentation was exactly as clean as the company's. I had done all of it while the company continued to grow, because the company was what I was protecting and it had to remain clean throughout. The month after the settlement, I focused on two things: settling into the Morningside house and closing the Charlotte engagement that would become the justification for our second office. The Charlotte engagement closed in June of 2022 and the decision to open the second office followed in August. I flew up to Charlotte twice to look at potential spaces, both times on the early Delta departure from Hartsfield-Jackson, both times back the same evening. We signed the lease on a suite in a building near the financial district in September, and Ketchera managed the build-out while I handled the hiring process for the 2 Charlotte-based staff members we brought on to support the initial client base there. It was, by the metrics that matter, a straightforward business expansion. Client demand in the geography, sufficient revenue to justify the overhead, a management structure capable of supporting a distributed operation. But it was also something else. It was the company 14 months after someone had tried to take it, opening a second office. It was the thing continuing to grow in the direction I had always projected it would grow, undisturbed and undiminished, on the exact timeline the conservative scenario had mapped. I thought about that on the flight back from Charlotte the evening we signed the lease, not triumphantly, not in terms of the legal proceeding that was now closed and behind me, but simply as a fact about trajectory. You build a thing correctly, you protect it correctly, you let it continue. That is the whole strategy. I hired a contractor to repaint 2 rooms. I bought a kitchen table at a small furniture store on Ponce de Leon Avenue, simple solid walnut room for 6, and I placed it in the morning light where I wanted it. Castor, my Rhodesian Ridgeback, claimed the rug beneath it immediately and has treated it as sovereign territory ever since. I cooked dinner at that table most nights. I called my mother on Sunday mornings. I kept the Google Sheets budget weekly the way I always had. 2 months after the settlement, my sister Adana came to Atlanta for a long weekend. We spent most of it doing ordinary things, cooking at the Morningside house, walking the neighborhood in the June heat with Castor moving ahead of us like he owned the block, sitting on the back porch in the evenings with wine and the comfortable quiet of 2 people who have known each other their whole lives. On the last evening she said, "You did it the right way." I said, "The right way was the only way I knew how." She said, "That's not true, you knew other ways, you chose this one." She was right, I had known other ways. I had watched people dissolve marriages with extended retaliation and performances of injury that satisfy something in the short term and cost everything over time. I had chosen documentation over devastation, process over performance. The structural integrity of the company over any satisfaction a louder exit might have briefly produced. That choice, not the legal outcome, is the thing I am most proud of when I look back at how that year unfolded. In September of 2022, 5 months after the settlement, my mother came to the Morningside house for dinner. She brought a Spiral Mead 5-star notebook, navy cover, college ruled, same brand she has always used, and a felt tip pen. After we ate, she sat at my new kitchen table and updated her household budget for the month. She did not make a speech, she did not say anything particularly notable about what I had been through, she just sat at my table in my house and kept her number. That was the most complete thing she could have done. It was the full statement of everything she had ever taught me, delivered without a single word. Dorothea sent me an email 6 weeks after the settlement, not through her attorney. From her own personal email address, the one she had used to send me Christmas schedules and event invitations for 5 years, 3 paragraphs carefully composed. The first acknowledged the end of the marriage with something I recognized as genuine regret. The second suggested gently that I had conducted the proceedings in ways that had been hard on Preston. The third said, I never understood the scale of what you were building. I did not treat it with the respect it warranted. I am sorry I called it little. I sat with that email for 2 weeks. Then I wrote back 4 sentences. I said I appreciated her saying so. I said the company was called ACA for Strategic Risk Advisors and that it was doing well. I wished Preston well in what he chose to build next. I said I hoped she was taking good care of herself. That was the last direct communication we have had. Preston is, by several accounts I have received without seeking, rebuilding his professional life at a different firm in Atlanta. I hope what he is building develops into something he can be genuinely proud of. I mean that without performance or magnanimity, the dissolution of a marriage does not require the diminishment of the other person to be complete. His trajectory is his own now, mine is mine. ACA for Strategic Risk Advisors has, as of this year, 22 full-time employees, 37 active client organizations, and 2 offices. The original Peachtree Street location in Atlanta and a second office in Charlotte, North Carolina that we opened 18 months ago. Ketchera is our chief operating officer. We are in formal preliminary conversations with 2 prospective acquisition partners, a process I am managing with Francis and a transaction advisory team at a midtown Atlanta firm, proceeding at the pace I determine is right. The Hartwell valuation from 2020, which placed the enterprise at $4,200,000, has been superseded by events in ways I will not state specifically but will describe as substantial. Here is what I actually learned. Not the satisfying story version, the version that is true. The first thing is about documentation, and I want you to hear it not as divorce preparation advice but as the foundational practice of anyone building anything real. Document everything that is yours: your company's formation date, your capital contributions, your client agreements, your bank statements, your payroll records. Your household budget month by month in a file you keep because you are the kind of person who keeps accurate records. The Google Sheets household file I maintained as a personal discipline, with no legal strategy behind it, no anticipation of litigation, simply because my mother taught me to track what comes in and what goes out, became in a divorce proceeding one of the most consequential documents in my case. Precision practiced as a daily routine becomes protection without ever having aimed to be anything other than precise. The habit and the protection are the same thing, and they cannot be separated after the fact, which means the only time to build them is before you need them. The second thing is about prenuptial agreements, and I need you to hear this carefully because it is the most counterintuitive part. A prenup is not inherently a document that disadvantages the person who signs it with less money. It is a document that defines what belongs to whom at the moment of signing. If you read it with complete attention, if you understand not only what it covers but what it has not thought to cover, you can sign it from a position of clarity rather than concession. The Calloway family's attorney drew up a document designed to protect their assets from any claim I might make. He did not address what I was building because he had decided it was not worth addressing. That was an error in risk assessment. The gap between his evaluation of my position and the actual value of that position is the entire substance of everything that followed. The third thing is about what fixed categories cost the people who maintain them. Dorothea called my company little for 5 years because she formed a category for me in 2015 and never updated it as the evidence changed year by year. In risk management, we call this anchoring bias, the systematic tendency to overweight the first information you received about a situation and structurally underweight every revision that follows. It is one of the most documented and costly errors in professional judgment, and it costs the person who practices it far more than it costs its target. Dorothea made herself incapable of seeing what was developing in front of her because she had already decided what I was. The lesson is not that you should perform success loudly to defeat other people's low expectations. The lesson is that their failure to see you accurately is entirely their problem to carry, not yours to correct. You build the thing, you maintain the records, you let the numbers be what the numbers are. The fourth thing is the one my mother gave me, and it is where every other lesson finds its foundation. The only thing between a plan and a wish is a number. Know your numbers, all of them. The revenue, the margin, the enterprise value, the account balances, the household budget line by line, the equity in your home, the terms of every instrument you hold. Not approximately, not in comfortable round figures that feel close enough, precisely. Write them down. A number written down is a fact. A fact is what holds up in a settlement conference when someone has organized a legal position around the assumption that you do not know what you have, or cannot prove what you have built, or will be too overwhelmed to demonstrate it clearly. Wishes, however sincerely held and however long maintained, do not survive discovery. I signed that prenuptial agreement with a steady hand and 11 pages of another family's certainty that they understood everything I owned and everything I was worth. I signed it because I had read it with complete attention and understood exactly what it said, and more importantly, exactly what it had not thought to say. I signed it because I had been writing numbers down since I was 11 years old at a kitchen table in Decatur, Georgia, with a felt tip pen and a woman beside me who understood that the most honest thing you can do for your own future is to see it clearly, count it accurately, and write it down. They thought they were protecting themselves from me. They were drawing a line that left everything I had already built on my side of it. They thought there was nothing there was already everything. And when they came to take what they assumed was available, they found a wall of documentation. A company with 22 employees and 37 clients and a Charlotte office and a valuation that had long since outgrown the number sitting in Francis's cabinet. and a woman standing exactly where she had been standing from the beginning, on the right side of every line she had drawn for herself, years before anyone in that family thought to look. I want to tell you something about the day my mother sat at my morningside table with her notebook, because it is the image I return to most often when I think about everything that happened across those years. She arrived at 6 in the evening on a Saturday in September. She had driven herself from Decatur, the same 40-minute route she had driven to visit me at every apartment and house I had ever lived in. She brought the notebook and the pen and a container of the rice and stew she had made that morning, because she always brings food when she comes, the same way she always brought food to every family event and every gathering and every moment that mattered, because feeding people is how she expresses the care she does not make speeches about. We ate at the kitchen table. We talked about my younger sisters, about her school year, about the Morningside neighborhood, about Castor's most recent act of boundary testing involving the neighbor's garden. We did not talk about the divorce proceedings. We did not talk about the settlement. We did not talk about Dorothea or Preston or the legal theory of transmutation or the 43-page Hartwell Partners report sitting in Francis's cabinet. We talked about the ordinary things that two people who love each other talk about when what they really want is to sit in the same room together and confirm that everything is intact. After dinner she opened the notebook. She updated her October budget while I made coffee. I watched her write the numbers in the specific way she has always written numbers, deliberate without hesitation, each figure placed exactly where she intends it. Income, fixed expenses, variable expenses, what remains. She has been keeping this record for 34 years. She kept it when my father was ill and money was uncertain. She kept it when he recovered and money was stable. She kept it through every fluctuation and adjustment and change that 34 years of a life contains, because the point of keeping the record is not that everything stays the same. The point is that you always know where you stand. She closed the notebook. She put the pen in her jacket pocket. She looked at me for a moment with the expression she had when I walked down that aisle in 2016, not worried, not sentimental, watchful and steady. She said, "You know where you stand." I said, "I know where I stand." She nodded. She finished her coffee. She drove herself back to Decatur on the same 40-minute route she has always driven. That was September of 2022. That is the moment I returned to when the harder parts of that year tried to define the whole story. Not the settlement conference, not the Hartwell valuation, not the 4 sentences I wrote back to Dorothea. The moment at the kitchen table, the notebook, the numbers on the page, the confirmation that I know where I stand, that is everything. That is what the notebook was always for.